Hey guys, welcome to the Ad Astra podcast, the podcast where we integrate space, policy, and technology. I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a Master's of Public Policy degree with a concentration in science and space policy.
And I'm a PhD in computer science and an all-around tech geek.
Okay guys, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at @AdAstraPodcast and subscribe to our mailing list on elemental.fm to get regular updates from the team. And today we're going to be talking about...
Well, today we actually have a new structure to the podcast, and we're going to try the structure out and see if we can continue it throughout the following weeks. So feel free to give us feedback on all of the social medias, on all of our social media sites, as well as elemental.fm. So we're going to start by talking about the latest news from Washington, space news highlight of the week. Set of international updates with international news, the latest in tech, where we talk about some cool new technology that's come out, or the unveiling of a cool new technology, which is what we'll get into today. And coming soon to space. So what's up and coming, things we see coming down the pike, new things in space, in the space community, space culture, so on and so forth. So on that note, we're going to get started with the latest from Washington. And Jack, I'll let you take the lead on the House approving the new NASA authorization bill.
Yeah. So like we've sort of been talking the last 2 weeks, that NASA has an authorization bill in Congress, and it passed unanimously in the Senate. And 2 weeks ago, the end of it was the 27th of February was when it was supposed to be voted on in the House, and everyone was expecting it to go through without a hitch. It gets pulled from the docket the morning of the vote. It was supposed to be around like a 1 or 2 o'clock vote. So last minute vote by all accounts, and or a last minute change rather. But just recently, just this last week, NASA, the House did pass the NASA authorization bill, which is great. That means, and it's the exact same language as on the Senate side. Like I explained last week, is sort of how a bill becomes a law. I mean, you can watch the Schoolhouse Rock video if you really want to.
The link will be in the show notes.
Yeah, but there's sort of a reconciliation process that has to happen before it goes on to the president. But because the Senate passed it and the House passed the exact same version, it goes directly to the president without any mediation or reconciliation. And if it gets signed, it gets put into law, and NASA gets authorized for $19.508 billion.
That 08 is really important.
That very, we're what's that science-y phrase, Newton? Significant figures.
Significant, yes.
That sciencey
phrase.
You're our resident science.
Oh, that one.
Sciencey geek. Yeah, that technical phrase. But so I think, Newton, you and I were talking about this, and I posted on my Facebook about this, that this is great that this authorization passed, but it really doesn't do much other than reorganize national priorities for space exploration. Now it is an increase from the 19, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 19.1 or 19.3 billion in fiscal year 2016. And for fiscal year 2017, it's an increase of about $200 to $300 million. And
which basically takes care of all of the engineers' raises, the cost of living raise.
It's a rounding error in the grand scheme of the federal government. But I've seen all of these. I mean, just every news media account, whether it's a publication or a newspaper or, Jeff Faust on Twitter, like talking about this. They're like, we passed the NASA authorization. It's great. This is one step forward. And it's one step forward, but it's not a great step. Small step. Not a great step.
In reality, I mean, I don't really see where the step was taken. I mean, it's just the bill basically maintains support for all of the major programs, James Webb Space Launch System, Orion Crew Vehicle, ISS. I mean, what's is there anything that's new that you've read of that's in this bill? Other than what NASA was planning for in the first place, like new Europa missions and things like that.
I mean, it's not the biggest new thing in there was, and we had talked about this. I don't know if it was in our 0th episode or if it was in our first episode, but talking about the manifest bill, which basically told, it was Congress telling the NASA administrator, whether it's Robert Lightfoot, who's the acting administrator now, or whoever comes after him as the real administrator, tells them every couple of years we request a report on the human exploration of Mars. Like, where are we on this, journey to Mars? Give us a roadmap. Like, what are the next milestones after SLS and Orion launches in 2018, 2019, and 2023, or whatever the cadence is supposed to be. And that's probably the biggest change. But when it comes to actual programs that are going on, the only thing is it changes sort of the funding level of different programs. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, as we get closer to the launch of James Webb, the budget's going down because there's a lot less to do. I mean, there's systems testing and making sure everything runs properly and making sure it gets put on the right spacecraft and, gets launched from the right place. Like, there's certain things that still have to happen, but it's not this huge multi-billion-dollar program anymore. They built it. They're done. They're on to other projects, a lot of these engineers.
Right.
So a lot of what the authorization does is it says, okay, we're on to the next step. There's a reason why why they called it the NASA Transition Act, or the Transition of NASA Act. Right. The word transition's in there for a reason, and that's because we're transitioning from sort of the beginning of the era that we're in of when NASA passed, or if NASA passed an authorization, it'd be great. But when Congress passed the last authorization in 2010, that sort of started this new, buildup of, or sort of the shutdown of Space Shuttle, the buildup of SLS and Orion. And then in, 2016, 2017, this new authorization, it's sort of, all right, we're past that. We're on to the next phase.
Right. Right. To your point, I mean, I saw when I read on the actual science.house.gov site that they do talk a little bit about what that term transition authorization means, directing the NASA administrator to seek reimbursement whenever responsibilities are transferred to NASA from another agency, or when NASA funds another agency's activities, which I thought was interesting. I'm not sure if that's something that we've really seen before in one of NASA's bills. Do you have any insight as to how that was funded before? Did that just come down from a larger pot?
It was sort of when NASA took over for NASA runs the A train, which is a series of satellites that passes over the United States every morning, basically, and gets a lot of remote sensing data.
The A for the AM train, and I believe the S train is what goes down, is what passes over the U.S. every PM. Why they called it the S train as opposed to the PM train, I'll never know.
The supper train.
Yes.
But so when NASA took over that, they really weren't given any extra money to do it. They were just kind of given this project and said, make it work with your current budget. This is sort of with the stipulations, the reimbursement that you're talking about. This is them codifying the process for if and when NASA needs to take something on or give something away. Now, that is sort of also coming from the same place of a lot of people on the Republican side saying, NOAA needs to be in charge of oceans
where I was
and
getting.
atmosphere.
Yep.
NASA is in charge of space. Forget the first A in NASA. It doesn't stand for aeronautics. It's sort of recategorizing our national priorities. And NOAA's facing a big cut, and NASA's facing an increase by inflation, barely. So sort of figuring out where there can be systems put in place to make sure that our current capabilities are kept up while not, I can't remember, Robert Walker and Pete Navarro were these two space policy advisors for the Trump campaign. And they wrote these two horrendous articles that basically called environmental monitoring like politically correct satellites. I don't know. They use some buzzword or something, but like this is the era that we're in of moving national priorities around based on the political climate. And NASA's going to get programs that it maybe wasn't expecting and going to lose programs it was looking forward to having. So
Right. And one of the other things that that's nice in this bill that we've seen is I guess it's the reinstatement of the Treat Astronauts Act, which gives NASA the ability to care for astronauts and enhance our understanding of the effects of space flight on the human body. Treat stands for To Research, Evaluate, Assess, and Treat Astronauts Act. And it apparently one of the biggest things that it funds is it funds specialized medical monitoring, diagnosis, and treatment of psychological and medical conditions for former astronauts and former payload specialists. So that's something that's really great. That's in this bill. It was in the 2016 reauthorization, or the previous 2015 to 2016 bill that came out, and it looks like it made it through again this year.
Yeah, and then it was also a separate bill as well, just as much. So the manifest bill was also its own thing and was sort of absorbed by the authorization. You see Congress do this every so often, especially with programs that aren't, or agencies that aren't huge, like NASA. I mean, NASA's 0.5% of the federal budget.
Yeah,
so
NASA's tiny.
Yeah, it's very small, very tiny,
Yes.
tiny agency. Does a lot, tiny agency. Yes. Not as small as some president's hands, but
It's not about the size of the agency, all right?
But what you see is, and especially the science committees on both the House and Senate side don't really want to get bogged down in looking after 4 or 5 different bills, so they'll just kind of package them all together and fit the language somehow. And because I mean, no one's going to disagree with the manifest bill if they agree with the Treat Astronauts and the reauthorization. And no one's going to disagree with the authorization if they're pro one or the other. I mean, everyone is just kind of on the same page. I mean, the transition bill passed the House by as close to a unanimous vote as possible, with it being a voice vote, which is, a bunch of congressmen yelling aye and then like 2 or 3 random people yelling nay. In the House chamber. So there's this massive amount of support for the bill. They just wanted to get it out the door, get it on the president's desk so they can start focusing on other things. Obviously, those other things include the Environmental Protection Agency and NOAA, which are both facing some pretty big cuts coming up. But that's, I feel, maybe a different podcast, because that could be... That's a whole different
spinoff show.
I know that could be our side project after this thing takes off.
Yeah,
but
so yeah, I mean, good to see NASA, being continued to be funded.
I still want to see an appropriations bill. I mean, because an authorization bill could give NASA $100 billion, but that doesn't mean anything unless the appropriators give them that amount of money.
Right.
So, as aspirational as the transition bill is, there's a lot of issues coming up for NASA and their budget, especially with there being sort of a 10 to 13% cut across discretionary spending to pay for the increase in defense spending that the president has sort of alluded to. And I mean, that's sequester level cuts. And we all know what happened to NASA during the sequester.
Right.
Not good things.
Right.
And then we're going to see another sequester in the next year, 2 years, with just the way that the budget's working. I mean, with I think they extended the what are the fiscal cliff is what they were calling it at the time, but they extended up the debt ceiling until like 2019 or something, or 2018 or something like that. So we're going to be facing that again, and with a 10 to 13% cut across the board for discretionary spending anyway, plus another sequester, NASA's not in the best side of the federal budget.
That will be during or right after another election year, though. So would you anticipate that having an impact on whether or not we go over that fiscal cliff or hit that debt ceiling or whatever they're going to phrase they're going to use for it?
It's just going to be a rehash of what was that 2013, where it's like right after an election, and Democrats did really well in 2012, and we took back or kept the presidency, kept the Senate, made a couple advances in the House. But, I mean, we still went over the cliff or faced the cliff, or I don't know. They come up with all these metaphors for it when really it's like a fiscal speed bump.
We should start using space metaphors just to make it more impactful. Like, are we going to dive into the black hole?
Oh, see, I was thinking like we're coming up on a conjunction. Like we got to move out of the way of something. So I would say that regardless of who wins in 2018, whether Kanye West is in the Senate or like whatever happens, it does not really matter. We're still going to be facing some budgetary restrictions, and NASA's always had to go through that. I mean, since the Nixon doctrine in after Apollo was over, 1972, Nixon brought in this sort of doctrine that still sort of reigns supreme today, that NASA fits amongst a series of national priorities. It's not its own separate thing, like Department of Defense is. So you're going to see NASA facing the same cuts that Department of Education, Department of Labor, Bureau of Indian Affairs, all these different agencies, all these small agencies, big agencies, whole departments, half of departments, like everyone's going to be facing these same financial struggles. It's sort of hitting at a really bad time. If we're going to get humans on Mars by 2033, which is, I mean, that's the goal of the stated in the Transition Act or in the Authorization Act, that we want humans on Mars by 2033, and asking the administrator to provide a roadmap to that. That roadmap's going to look a couple miles longer, a couple years longer if we make significant cuts to our space and science programs.
But not if Elon gets there first.
Okay, all right. I'll play nice today. I won't say anything. Well, let's talk beyond Mars.
Beyond Mars. So that does it for latest from Washington. Let's hit the space news highlight of the week. And that has to do with NASA apparently formally naming its next Europa mission, Europa Clipper. Now, I remember seeing some articles a couple of years ago with the name Europa Clipper, but I think it was just being thrown around at that point. The name kind of harkens back to the Clipper ships that sailed across the oceans of Earth in the early 19th century. And basically the idea for this mission is for us to send a craft out to Europa to do about 40 to 45 flybys. So it just sail past Europa at a rapid cadence every roughly 2 weeks, and image the moon's icy surface at a very high resolution, better than we've ever seen before, and investigate its composition and the structure of its interior, icy, crusty shell. One of the big questions that gets raised with this, and this is going to be the engineering challenge over the next. It looks like they're shooting for 2020, roughly in the early 2020s for this. So over the next 4 years is, how are we going to deal with the radiation that's at Jupiter? Okay, this is us dealing with a radiation problem without even having to send humans, which is a problem we talked about last week. But just how to deal with the massive amount of radiation that's coming from Jupiter that's heating up, that's actively heating up Europa. So for reference, the radiation coming off of Jupiter is about 10 times as strong as that of the Earth. And when you take into account the minimal atmosphere on Titan, you get a massive amount of radiation. To give you some perspective, if a person were standing if a person were standing on the surface of Europa, they'd be getting about they'd be getting about 5.4 sieverts a day of radiation. Now, let me put that in even more perspective, because not everybody deals in sieverts, right? On Mars,
I do. I measure everything in sieverts.
I feel like there are some people in Tacoma Park who fall into that same category, where they think like their cell phone is trying to kill them. How many sieverts are these eggs that I'm going to be getting? No. But to put that in perspective, okay, you get 5.4 sieverts a day on Europa. If you were standing on the surface of Mars, you'd be getting about 0.7 millisieverts a day. Okay. The astronauts in the space station, depending on the sun being out, sun not being out, radiation, time of day, things like that coming from Earth's own magnetosphere, they get roughly 0.4 to 1 millisieverts a day. Standing on Earth, you get about 8.2 microsieverts a day, so 8.2 thousandths of a sievert. Okay, so you're talking about literally coming close to a million times more radiation per day if you were to stand on the surface of Europa. So obviously we're not sending humans there, but sending robotic aircraft there, or robotic spacecraft, excuse me. That's a thing someone shouldn't say when talking about space. But to send that kind of spacecraft there, that type of radiation can cause damage to the electronic equipment, not only just for communication, but just even functioning. That level of radiation, can cause serious damage to the circuit boards that are on board, even for any modern circuitry that we know about. So that radiation issue is going to need to be solved over the next 4 years. And what's going to be interesting when the progress that they make on that will actually help out when it comes to, let's say, a Mars mission. Because once you start getting better at shielding radiation on a ship with no life forms on it, hopefully you can develop technologies from that will help you shield, for instance, a Mars spacecraft with two citizens or astronauts on it, or more citizens and astronauts on it.
And I know this is something that Juno, which is the spacecraft currently orbiting Jupiter, had to deal with. I remember when Juno arrived in September of last year, that was something that everyone talked about, was because the orbit that Juno was coming into at Jupiter was this highly elliptical polar orbit. It was kind of coming up and around Jupiter, and it had to basically pass through this radiation belt, and they didn't know, how close they could get to being within the atmosphere of Jupiter and being within this radiation belt, like where the sweet spot was. And they eventually found it, but this seems to be a common theme that space is dangerous. I mean, we all know that. Space is easy according to the last episode, no. But space is dangerous for people and for robotics. What did Juno do that was so different?
Juno, honestly, it's not that they did something that's significantly different. They survived effectively. Going into they outfitted Juno with what they called a quote unquote suit of armor to lower the dose of radiation going, that would hit that would barrage its circuitry. Once going, Jupiter has a magnetic field that is about 20,000 times more powerful than the Earth's the Earth's magnetic field. And, so there's just a huge swarm of electrons that are accelerated at nearly the speed of light near that magnetic field. And once they hit the spacecraft, they immediately begin to ricochet and release energy, creating sort of secondary photons and particles, which then ricochet. And it's just a spray of radiation bullets. So they basically surrounded the craft in about 400 pounds of titanium, with about half an inch thick walls, and that allowed for some survivability of Juno.
So if we dip the Clipper in like a vat of like lead and let it solidify, that should be fine, right?
Titanium.
It's easy to launch. It's not heavy. Wouldn't weigh it down or anything.
Oh yeah, it'd be a piece of cake. The problem is, once you start casing your spaceship in a titanium vault, you run into the problem of being able to communicate with your instruments. So they're going to have to massively, they're going to have to massively shield this thing and figure out how to get comms out, in light of all of that. In light of all that radiation, which in and of itself affects communication, because you're passing communication over RF frequencies, right? So you have to make sure you're operating at a frequency that won't get jammed or disrupted by the radiation itself. So yeah, it's complicated. It's not a far out. This isn't a far off engineering task to do. But it is a task. It is a task to be able to withstand the radiation from something as massive as Jupiter. And I'm happy to see us really approach that problem, because once again, if they launch this in the early 2020s, the Mars mission happens in the early 2030s, we hopefully will have solved a good chunk of these radiation issues by the early 2020s, and will have stopped that, or at least significantly lowered the risk of that becoming a threat to the citizens. I keep saying citizens as if Musk is going to get there. See, he's even convincing me now.
He's influencing our language.
Yeah, exactly. To the astronauts that are going to end up on Mars. So to some extent, you can view this as a bit of a seedling or a risk reduction program. That's a very DoD term, by the way, seedling. A risk reduction program for shielding important craft from radiation. So this should be interesting.
Yeah. So transition into something that is also super dangerous in space. We've only ever sent anything here a handful of times, and when we land anything on the surface, it survives for maybe a couple hours. Venus is in the news. International news, too.
Yes.
It's actually broken out from just being that bright light in the sky before the sun rises to being back in the news. So yeah, there's this partnership that we have with this country called Russia, that we've sort of been fostering since the International Space Station. And we're sort of getting to the point where we're moving beyond the ISS solely as an international playground. And I mean, we've used Mars for this. Juno has, I think, a couple international instruments on it, I think. But really sort of making the exploration of outer space an international effort. the U.S. and Russia are exploring the option of going back to Venus.
Which is incredible. So the Russians went to Venus, before, I believe that was before we even had Apollo, or at least before we had a significant number of manned space flights, and they dropped a couple of landers there, like you said, that they survived a very, very small amount of time. But going back and studying Venus is actually quite important, and I'm glad this Russian institute is doing it. It's the Russian IKI, the Academy of Sciences Space Research Institute. Apparently, that's it abbreviated IKI in Russia. But they came out with a report and delivered it to NASA headquarters, stating that they were going to assess and refine the science objectives of their mission to Venus, and it sounds like we will be working with them. Now, what's going to be interesting about Venus is I'm assuming this is going to be another craft that they're going to send to first do some observations and then collide or descend down into the planet. Once it does that, the goal really isn't to take a look mostly at the surface, although it's supposed to be on the surface for a few hours and get that information. Well, one of the big goals is to look at the atmosphere, looking at what the greenhouse effect looks like when greenhouse goes mad. And pull down some of those lessons to give sort of a tutorial on Venus's history and how we could potentially, and this is daring to say, learn from that history.
Well, we're not too far off from becoming Venus. Rapid, greenhouse gas or greenhouse effect, acid rain. I mean, these aren't unfamiliar terms, and we talk about this in jest a little bit, but there certainly is something we can learn from this. I mean, it's very similar processes.
We're not going to get as far as bad as Venus, but
just watch us. Is that
America's
a challenge?
America's like, hold my beer.
I cry a tear.
I know. It's that whole laugh cry that's becoming more and more popular lately,
especially here in DC.
Yes, but yeah, the idea is that once again it would actually orbit Venus for about 3 years and then send a lander that would be able to survive the harsh conditions of the surface for a few hours. So we should see quite a bit from that. I'm interested in seeing what we can see in their upper atmosphere more than I am of just the surface. I'm getting recorded saying that now, so watch we find something super interesting on the surface in
life
the 2020s.
Found not on Mars or Europa or Titan, but on Venus.
Just to prove Newton wrong.
Well, I mean, that is a very interesting point. I remember I was reading not the NASA news article about it, but there was some interview with Jim Green at NASA and other people who were at this planetary science workshop or planetary science 2050 workshop that was going on a couple weeks ago at NASA headquarters, talking about using having a almost an aircraft thing skim across the top of Venus's atmosphere, which would be really cool because I'm certain it'll be utilizing some sort of drone technology because there's no way that we're going to be able to control it in real time because it's, there's that time delay between here and Venus that sometimes we forget about. I think it's less than the 23 minutes to get to Mars, but it's still a significant time delay. Just for context, the moon is a 1 second time delay, and that's to there and back. So to get to Venus and back and us to use that information and process something and then tell a drone to fly something, it might not mean that the drone lasts very long. We need something that's autonomous and gathers the correct data. So I think there's a lot of science that can be sort of, taken out of this project, especially since this is the first Venus lander mission since Vega 2, which landed in June of 1985.
Right. So
this was back when the Soviet Union existed. This wasn't even Russia. This was the Soviet Union sent something and landed it on the surface of Venus. Since then, there have been no landers on Venus. It's almost been completely forgotten. It got visited by Messenger and a couple other spacecraft going to Mercury and the rest of the inner solar system. Right. But Venus has sort of been glanced over, and I feel with sort of the maturing of the space exploration business, I think Venus is going to start to become a very hot topic. Not
I see what you did there.
It's a bit of a pun because it's like 900 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade on Venus, and the sulfuric acid raining down. It's not a fun place to be, but we can learn a lot from it.
It's literally if there is a hell, that's it. Like that's Venus is it.
It's pretty close to a hellish landscape.
Yeah. If you recall, the last mission that NASA actually sent to explore Venus was Magellan back in 1990. That was one of JPL's, and it basically used radar to map about 98% of the planet at a resolution of about 330 feet, which is pretty incredible. There's actually a ton of open data about that on NASA.gov. I believe it's solarsystem.nasa.gov/planet/Venus. If you guys feel like taking a look, it should be in the show notes as well. So yeah, it looks like we'll be cooperating with our Russian partners on that. It's great news. And I hope to see more coming out of Venus. Maybe we'll find some extremophiles out there.
Yeah, it could be a lot of fun. There could be a lot of fun stuff on Venus. Not that we'll ever go there.
Yeah, I'm not up for that mission. Yeah. No, I don't think you're gonna find any takers like you're finding from Mars. Like it's a certain one-way trip to Venus.
Well, Andy Weir, author of The Martian, is working on a sequel to The Martian. I know. But they're actually it'd be the third in a trilogy, because he wrote a short story right after he released The Martian called The Venetian. Mm-hmm. And it's about 4 sentences long, and all it says is, the spacecraft landed on Venus, the astronauts donned their EVA suits, the doors opened, everyone was vaporized within a matter of seconds. So it's a fun time. So let's talk about some tech. Latest in tech.
So it looks like nothing went on in the tech now. I'm just kidding. So
there's nothing ever happens in tech.
Nothing happens in technology. Those computer scientists, engineers, they're all lazy. So one of the big interesting things that I wanted to talk about today was so Jeff Bezos. And not to sound like CNN, but Jeff Bezos sent out a tweet on March 7th.
Breaking news. Wolf Blitzer.
Breaking news. He went to my college, University of Buffalo. But yeah, Jeff Bezos sent out a tweet on March 7th and a video around the same time showing off Blue Origin. And the idea was that they would announce that that Blue Origin's first customer for the New Glenn for the New Glenn multi-stage rocket would be Eutelsat. They're an European satellite communications company. So he released it was a pretty cool video showing a full animation of how the launch and delivery would go with a 2-stage rocket, basically. The video shows the craft launching, separating its second stage, having it land on a launch pad with, and I don't know if you caught this when you looked at the video, but the launch pad, on the launch pad was written Blue Origin's slogan, Gradatim Ferocite, which is Latin for step by step, ferociously, which I thought was funny.
Landing on a drone ship, though, that sounds kind of familiar.
Yeah.
And that was all anybody could talk about. And I'm very upset about this, that all anybody could talk about after this announcement was, wow, that looks a lot like SpaceX. Which just goes to show that, SpaceX is really, I mean, they're new to the game still. I mean,
Right.
ULA's been around a lot longer than they have and been a lot more successful than them, but they haven't been doing the same sort of media blitz that SpaceX is doing, and has defined the game when it comes to reusability. It's now up to Blue Origin to say, all right, SpaceX, like, you say you're reusable, but you've yet to reuse a rocket. We're going to do it on the first go.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and once again, you're still taking, not that SpaceX is releasing all of its IP, but you're taking a lot of the research that's been done over the last couple of decades. So you still have sort of a leg up in doing it, and you have the potential of doing it better. Basically knowing that all of the past mistakes have been addressed. So just kind of going back to New Glenn. New Glenn is the follow-on program to Blue Origin's suborbital New Shepard launch system, a rocket and capsule designed to fly payloads and passengers to about 63 miles above the planet. New Glenn will have about twice the lift capacity of SpaceX's current Falcon 9 rocket, with the ability to put about 100,000 pounds into LEO. It still won't be able to put more than the Falcon Heavy, but that's not its intent. Falcon Heavy should still be able to lift about 30 to 35% more than the actual New Glenn. So I'm glad to see. And I posted this on my Facebook the other day. Now it's a game. Now there are 3, hopefully, competitors.
Enter
this
player 3.
Yeah, enter player 3. There's 3 major competitors in this commercial space market, which I mean, I'm hoping they're able to at least give us a demonstration or put on some type of show fairly soon. The estimated delivery date for Eutelsat, for Blue Origin delivering the rocket and delivering the satellites into space, Eutelsat satellites into space, is in 2022. So that should be interesting if they're able to do it, for a customer and land it right off the bat. Either way, hopefully they'll do it for the customer. But if they can prove that they can land it as well, I mean, this is going to become a very competitive market, and I'm excited.
Yeah, I mean, so I think in the description or the show notes, there's a Blue Origin released something, and this is a while back when New Glenn was first announced, a comparison between New Glenn and all of the other major launch providers and historical launch providers. So that includes the Saturn V, and showing how New Glenn compares. And of course, they haven't built one yet.
Right.
But this it's supposed to show, like, this is our concept for what it's going to be. And I mean, looking at it right now, I mean, just the 2-stage New Glenn, because there's a 3-stage variant as well to get into really high orbits or beyond. I want Tom to do like a reverby thing when I say beyond. Beyond. But even the 2-stage variant is about 1.5 times the size of a Falcon 9. And it's almost twice as thick in diameter, it looks like. I mean, the Falcon 9 is a skinny rocket, as most rockets are, but the New Glenn is this, bulky, massive thing that is supposed to really kind of blow everybody out of the water. And I'm really excited to see this. I mean, I've been a Jeff Bezos fan, maybe a little bit longer than I've been an Elon Musk fan.
Long time
fan, first time caller. But I'm really excited to see where this goes, because this also puts ULA in a position, and puts, let's not forget our friends over at Orbital ATK, puts them in a position of, they haven't, although they're the reliable option, and I certainly appreciate having a reliable option for either getting crews to space, cargo, or satellites, but they're not innovating, that word, innovating, at the same rate or in the same capacity that these sort of startup space exploration companies are doing.
But ULA to kind of to back them up a little bit, they have a bit of a different market. They're competing in this market as well as just generally serving NASA and DoD and X and Y and Z. I mean, they launch all the time for the Air Force. They're funded by a ton of different contracts, from the JPSS to some of the more proprietary NRO and Air Force satellites. That's on a public website. I'm not just saying. I'm not just saying.
This isn't some classified information you're giving us. Another CIA leak.
Right. We've had too many of those.
What, are our satellites watching us now too? First, we have to worry about our televisions, then our microwaves.
Oh God!
But see, we're topical.
Yeah, yep. But yeah, so ULA already has this, this existing, very well established market. The only time I could really see this is just about ULA being able to sustain itself in that commercial market as well. They're not going to go bankrupt once these other two start to really come into the private, the commercial space world and start to get more and more customers on the private sector side. The only time they would be in trouble is if they started taking over more and more government contracts, which I just can't see, because the needs are different.
And the Air Force has come out and said that ULA is their primary service provider. I mean, it's the position of the federal government to encourage innovation and economic expansion. But when it comes to something as high stakes as launching a satellite, I mean, if the Air Force is to launch a satellite, whether it's a MilSatcom, military satellite communications, or some sort of weather satellite, or whatever it happens to be, if that thing blows up on the pad, not only is it the company that is paying for it, it's also the American taxpayer, and not just in the we pay for that contract. We're paying the federal government to provide security, and if it can't do that properly, that whatever company that is that blew up on the launch pad is not going to be doing too hot in the eyes of the federal government. And that's why SpaceX is sort of, they had their one of their launch manifests got leaked or something. I think Forbes had it, or Wall Street Journal had it like 2 years ago or something, and it showed that about half of their contracts were government. I'd be shocked if you told me that half of their contracts were government now. I mean, I think SpaceX is trying to become more.
No, I can see it. I can still see it being government now, primarily on the research and development side, not government servicing, not literally just sending things up for them. But I could see them. I could see from the R&D side still having a large number of contracts to do new and innovative. To create new con ops, basically. That's new concept of operations. Once again, government speak. Sorry, guys.
Gov speak.
Yeah, gov speak. Welcome to DC. To create new concepts of operations based on the new capabilities that they're developing. So even though the new capabilities aren't quite there yet, I'm sure the government still wants to be researching 10, 20 years into the future. As to what sort of missions they could conduct using the new capabilities.
Oh, so. Yeah. No, I mean, especially with, this is just looking at the civil side, looking at commercial crew and commercial cargo. I mean, SpaceX gets a lot of money from both of those programs to develop these services and develop this technology. But I'm saying is you're not going to be seeing a lot of high stakes satellites going up on a Falcon 9.
No, and part of that too is, you talked about reliability, but part of it's history. Looking at, the government has a ton of restrictions and policies about being competitive, maintaining competition when it comes to government contracts, things like that. But there's also, to some extent a human element in I want to go with the people that I know and have been working with, as well as just people that I know a team that I know I can rely on. And for the last few decades, that's been the groups that comprise the ULA, and I think it's going to continue to be that for a good while longer. SpaceX, quite frankly, and same thing with Blue Origins, just quite frankly don't have the capabilities, the reliability, or the history that the ULA has with the federal government. So I think they'll be hyper competitive in the private market, which I think is fine for their funding, for what's required to make either of those companies profitable. But I can't see them diving onto the other side, anytime soon.
Yeah, and I mean, so we're I was just about to say, let's not forget what brought us to this topic, Blue Origin. They haven't proved that they can even get to orbit. I mean, with New Shepard, they prove that they can do suborbital really well and reuse the same booster 5 times.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see if they do any public tests before 2022. Obviously, to build up hype for it and the momentum for getting to that launch, they probably should. They can't remain in the shadows the whole time without people kind of being like, are they actually even really doing anything? Or,
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't they have something slated, like a test flight slated for 2019? I'll have to go back and check my notes, but maybe that was from an earlier article that I saw, and then it got pushed back. But
I was hearing the rumor mill says before the end of the decade. Now, whether you consider that December 31st, 2019 or December 31st, 2020 is up for debate.
Right.
But they are saying, Blue Origin is saying pretty publicly, actually, at this point, that the rumor mill, Blue Origin is saying by the end of the decade, they're going to be launching New Glenn test flights. How soon they can be developed is sort of up in the air. Us in the space policy community kind of anticipate it being later rather than earlier, especially because Blue Origin, unlike ULA and SpaceX, like what we were just talking about, getting a lot of government funding, Blue Origin gets no government funding. They got a couple contracts to develop some like really small parts, some really small tech transfer stuff, but like not designing rockets or building engines or rocket motors or anything. I mean, they're doing this all from scratch, all, not off the books, but like out of the public eye. So Blue Origin might actually be the first fully commercial space company.
Yep.
Which would be really, really cool, because that means that we're entering this new era of, space is now a commercial endeavor.
Right.
As much as whether commercial can really do things faster, better, and cheaper than government can is still up for debate. But it's showing that there's a maturing of the market and a maturing of our culture to accept that, okay, you can have a company that doesn't take a single government dollar and be successful in space exploration.
I wouldn't say, so going back, I wouldn't say it's up for debate. I would state that the commercial market can do things faster, better, and cheaper than the US government, or than a government can do. But the commercial market can only do so many things, and a government's allowed to do more, basically.
They don't have a board of directors or a group of stakeholders they have to go to and say, hey, we blew up the last 4 rockets. Can we buy a 5th one? I mean, the government's able to do that. Whereas on the private side, there's a lot more, you have to have a lot more buy-in and a lot more, finesse with the cash.
not to get too politically sciencey, if that's a thing.
Never, not on this podcast.
but a government is. I'm gonna repeat this phrase because it's true. It's supposed to do for the people what the people can't do for themselves, and it's all. But with that comes advancing the stature of the state that you're in, and no commercial company, going back to the things that we've been talking about, has a real vested reason or interest in going to Venus or exploring Europa, doing any of those things. Those things are done to have the people as a collective execute these missions which grant us scientific knowledge that overall helps humankind, but particularly helps the states that are performing those missions. So that's one of many reasons why it's very hard to compare what those two entities could do, the commercial markets and the state.
All right, I agree.
But that's getting a little too deep.
a little too deep, and we're running up on an hour, so I guess the last segment, coming soon to space. I put this in to our show notes. I was watching Designated Survivor, which everyone should go watch that. It's a fun little alternate reality show. No, I mean I think it's a good show. Just saying, endorsing them right now. But
I hope we're getting paid for that.
Yeah, I hope so too. But there's this new movie coming out. It's got Ryan Reynolds in it, called Life, and I was super excited when I saw the commercial. And it was this movie, and it's like, on the International Space Station, dun dun, and you see like this craft go by that doesn't really look like the International Space Station too much, but you kind of assume that it is. And you have a bunch of astronauts on board, and it's actually almost kind of seemed like a fun little exploratory movie, and then it turns out to be a horror movie about some thing that comes back from Mars, and it's if you had combined Apollo 18, if anyone saw that horrible, the directors are going to find this podcast and like rail against us, but like this, it's a sci-fi
1-star
B movie.
reviews.
Yeah, it's a sci-fi B movie that is about astronauts on the moon. It's the last lunar mission. They find aliens, and the Russians are somehow involved. I don't know, really weird stuff. If you mix that with John Carpenter's The Thing, the 1985, I want to say, horror movie about the thing that comes from the meteorite, and it can turn into other people, and it kills everybody. Great movies. Well, maybe not Apollo 18, but it seemed like kind of a meshing of those two, of this, we have to save the rest of humanity and destroy this now before it, we have to sacrifice ourselves. And I mean, it looks like a little fun movie, but what I'm sort of wondering is where's our culture going? I mean, a couple of years ago, all we had we had The Martian and Interstellar, which are these uplifting science fiction space exploration movies, and now we have Life, It's Coming to Kill You. Like, that should be the tagline. Where is our culture going with this?
I did see that. I saw that back in I saw Get Out this weekend, and I think there was a preview for that movie there, and that was actually one of my first thoughts. That's interesting. We're really starting to dive into these movies about space and colonization, and it's really starting to kind of eke out into popular culture. I mean, you had Passengers last year, which I still haven't seen, but I'll see it at some point. Didn't get the greatest reviews, but there's
Chris
still
Pratt,
these movies. Right? Yeah, Chris Pratt and J-Law, and
Hunger Games in space.
Yeah, Hunger Games in space, basically. But we're getting all of these movies that are focused on topics that before, I think Jack and I were the two people talking about two people talking about space colonization
we were
at
cool
the
the
bar.
Cool.
Just kind of ahead of our time there.
Yeah.
But now you're getting all of these movies that are focused on concepts that it seems that directors in Hollywood have just finally taken some interest to. also may have a little help from NASA's social media and communications department, because they have a fantastic communications department that I know reaches out to Hollywood on a fairly regular basis. It just seems like that pipeline is starting to open up and is accessing more writers and directors, which is kind of nice.
And that's not necessarily anything new to NASA. I mean, NASA's been NASA's been a media mogul for a while. I mean, like, there's a reason why the meatball and spaghetti logo is like one of the most well-recognized logos worldwide. It's 0.5% of the federal budget. I'm going to keep reiterating that number for all you people out there who think it's 30%. I wish it was 30%. But it's 0.5% of the federal budget. We'd
be living these movies if it was 30%.
like it's 0.5% of the federal budget. It isn't like any major national priority outside of like the space communities. And I mean, we're pretty small compared to like healthcare and education. Like, people who value that more is a lot bigger demographic. But like, NASA just is this monsterly big, well-recognized thing. I don't even know the right words to describe how astronomically well known. Like I don't think anybody knows NASA more, or more people know anything more than NASA. Like, it's like Coca-Cola,
Superman,
Jesus, NASA. I mean, like, that's and the Beatles. Throw the Beatles in there because they're more popular than God. Yeah. But I wonder how many people will get that reference. But I mean, this is one of these things that NASA owns its culture, and is able to have these pipelines to Hollywood and to wherever the writer town is. I don't know. Right? Do authors have a Hollywood? Like, actors have Hollywood, and Broadway. Where do authors?
It's whatever town all the restaurants and bars are in. Like, it's the adjacent town,
Hemingwaysville.
Yeah,
it's where all the bourbon is.
Yeah, what I'm interested in seeing is when do we get out of the phase where every space film has to be where every space film that's not like a comic book film like Guardians of the Galaxy has to be this like horror film where everything goes incredibly wrong.
Well, I mean, that's been our experience up till this point, is that space is difficult, obviously. But that, like, the quote, Houston, we have a problem. It's these memorable moments are born out of moments of strife for NASA and for space exploration. But you're right. Like, when do we get to that tipping point where it's like we just have a movie that's set in space, that's the problem isn't that like their spaceship is broken or that they don't have enough oxygen or something. It's that it's like it's a
romantic problem.
Yeah, like it's a romantic, like it's like a sitcom in space.
Right.
I mean, we already kind of saw a little bit of this with like Firefly, and you see this with Star Wars and Star Trek, but like to get that new generation in. I mean, Firefly is sort of a new generation, but like your Star Wars and Star Trek, like what's the next progression? Like, are we going to have a sitcom in space? Are we going to have a like rom-com in space? Like I want to see Sleepless on Saturn's moons, not Sleepless in Seattle. Yeah, like I feel
space
like
might be the only way that I watch a reality TV show. I'm just saying.
Okay, don't bring up
the reality
Mars
TV
One.
Industry.
Don't bring up Mars One. I saw a tweet the other day, Sarcastic Rover, which shout out to Sarcastic Rover for being like one of my favorite Twitter accounts. But Sarcastic Rover tweeted something like retweeting or quote tweeting, whatever they call it, Mars One. They had some announcement or something. And Sarcastic Rover was like, wait, you guys are still around? Like, Mars One still exists? And I guess it does. And they're posting things on their social media accounts, but
that's literally happened several times in conversation over the last 2 years. I swear to God. Wait, they're still around?
Mars One, you really exist still? Well,
yeah, it's usually with that tone. So
yeah. Oh, great. Mars One people. They're not. I don't know. I don't know who I have more of a beef with right now, whether it's the Mars One folks or the lunatics.
yeah, ooh, the lunatics definitely, like hands down.
Well, I mean, so there's not to disparage anyone who thinks like moon is a viable option. I think the moon could very well be a viable option if done correctly. It's these people who think that we can use it somehow as a gas station, like Sunoco is just going to come out of their way and be like, all right, we're going to fund the first helium-3 depot on the moon. That's not going to happen. I mean, let's be realistic about the moon. Like, we can use the moon as a proving ground. We need to use something as a proving ground, but it's not going to, we're not going to spend another 20 years trying to, colonize the moon or something and then have nothing happen with it because it's not as glamorous and doesn't fit the same cultural profile as Mars does. I mean,
let Elon do it. That's what I say.
Yeah. You know what? Let commercial take care of low Earth orbit and cislunar space. NASA, go to Mars.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
I'm fine with that.
So I guess that is it for this episode 3 of Ad Astra Podcast. As always, follow us on social media, both our personal accounts as well as the Ad Astra Podcast, and sign up at elemental.fm to get all of our email updates and keep in contact with us. As always, I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.